Welcome to this tutorial where we used Unity's new input system to create simple movement for a 2D platformer. In order to get the new input system, we're going to have to download it from the package manager. So we're going to go to the window file, go to the package manager, and then once the package manager opens up, we can search in the Unity registry for our input system, this thing right here, and then if we click install, it will start installing the input system into our game. Once the input system has been downloaded, you can X out of the package manager, and inside of our simple scene right here, we're going to have to create a few things. We're going to create a 2D object, a sprite, and a square. We can name this square our player, because this is going to be our player. To the player, we're going to add a box collider 2D to it, and we're also going to add a rigid body 2D to our player too, just so that it can move. We can reset the transform of this player so that it's in the middle of our little scene right here. And then we are going to get a 2D object, a sprite, and a square. We can name this ground. And then we can move the ground all the way to the bottom and then scale it on the ZX axis. We're also going to add a box collider to our ground right here. And then we can change the color of our ground to something like black so that we know it is our ground. What we're going to want to have to do is on our player, we're also going to add an input system. We're going to add an player input on our player with this new input system. And then there's a little bubble right here that tells us that we don't have one yet, and then I'm going to click create actions to create one. It's going to put it in a folder. I'm going to name this player, click save, and then once it's finally compiled, I'm going to have this right here, and this is going to be the actions for our player. Right now we have move, look, and fire. For move, you can see that it's W, S, A, and D for the keyboard, and then the left stick for the gamepad, and then all of the other gamepad controllers that you want. Also, we're going to want to add a jump to this, so we can click the little plus right there, make it jump. And then down here in this blue, it says no binding. We can click keyboard and mouse, and then in the path, we can have keyboard and space, and then that would be the key that we will jump for. If you want to add any other keys to make your player jump, like we can add another binding, and then we can add a gamepad or a touch or a joystick. You can add all of those bindings to your jump action if you'd like to. We can just save this right here before we X out, and then we can drag this player input into our player input action asset, and then we're going to have to create a script, and then we're going to add that to our player just to make our player move with this new player input. So we can right click on in the assets folder, create a C# script, and then we can name this script player movement. And then once we have this script, we can open it up in our coding editor to be able to code inside of this script. And then once we're in our coding editor, up here at the top, it says using Unity Engine. We're going to have to add another one. So we're going to type using Unity Engine .input system. And this just lets us be able to use the methods from the new input system. We're going to add a few variables at the top. We're going to add a public reference to our rigid body 2D. We can name this rigid body 2D our rigid body 2D. And then we're also going to want to have a private float, and then we're going to name this horizontal movement. We can have a public float. We can name this speed. We can set this to something like 8. And then we're going to have another public. We're going to have a public jump height. We can set this to something like 10 right now. We're going to get a public float jump height, and we're going to set that to 10. We're going to have a private bool, and this is going to be is grounded, and then we're going to have we can have a public layer mask, and this is going to be our ground layer. and then we can have another public transform, and then this is going to be a ground check circle. And this is looking similar to our simple 2D platformer movement because it is pretty much the same. It's just we have different methods for each of our moving, so it makes it a lot easier instead of having to type out all of the code. So inside of update, we can set is grounded, and we're going to set this equal to physics 2D dot overlap circle, and then just like before, this overlap circle takes a few different parameters here. The first one will be our ground check circle dot position, the position of our ground check circle, and then the second will be the radius, so we can just put this to 0.1 f. The third will be the layer mask, so we can put in our ground layer. And then this will give back if this is true or not. And then we're going to want to create a public void, and we can make this move. We can make this method named move, and this is going to be the same move that was in our player input actions that we created our jump and move for. So this is going to be our public void move. And then inside of these parameters right here, we're going to have an input action, and then we can have an input action dot callback context, and then this is just the WASD or the other gamepad controllers that we had. So we can just name this trigger. So that'll be the trigger keys. We can get our horizontal movement. And then our horizontal movement, we're going to set this equal to our trigger, and then the trigger dot read value with these brackets right here, and the read value is going to be a vector2 and then parentheses dot x. And then what this does, the trigger is a value, it's a vector2, but we only want the x value of the vector2 because that's going to be our horizontal movement. So we have this right here, and so every time that we push the W, S, A, S, and D keys, this is going to trigger this horizontal movement and give us the x value of the vector2. So inside of update, we can get our rigid body 2D dot velocity, and we can set this equal to a new vector2. And then in the x-axis, we can get our horizontal movement times our speed, and then we can get our rigid body 2D dot velocity dot y on the y-axis, because we don't want to change our velocity on the y-axis if we're just moving left and right. And now we're going to see if we jump. So we're going to get a public void. We can name this jump, just as the same as the jump method in our input actions. And then we're going to get another input action dot callback context. We can name this trigger. And then in this, we're going to see if we push this button and then jumped. So if is grounded. So if we're on the ground, if is grounded, and trigger dot performed. That means since we set this to space, or you set this to whatever you wanted to have, if we pushed the space button or whatever other key that we had, trigger dot performed will be set to true. So if we are on the ground and we jump, and then we can get our rigid body 2D dot velocity and set this equal to a new vector2, and then on the x-axis we'll just get our rigid body 2D dot velocity dot x, so we don't change our velocity on the x when we're jumping, and then we can just put in our jump height here for the velocity on the y, because we're going to want to jump. So now if we go back into our Unity editor and then it compiles, once it compiles we can add this script onto our player, and then we will be able to move with our player. Once we're back in the Unity editor, we can go into our player game object. Inside this player input and the behavior, we have send messages right now, but we're going to have invoke Unity events. We can drag our player movement script down into our player. We can drag our rigid body 2D into it. It's going to look for a ground check circle and the ground layer. For the ground check circle on our player, we can right click and create an empty. We can name this our ground check circle, and then we can just position this at the bottom of the player. And then for the ground layer, we can go to our ground. On the layer, click add layer, and then on user layer 6 we can just type ground. And then on the ground, once we go back to the ground, inside a layer we can just add the ground. We can add the ground layer onto the ground so that the player is able to jump. We can go back to the player, and then in this ground layer, in the drop down, click ground. And then in our player input, we can open up this events category right here, and then we can open up this player category right here, and then here we have move, look, fire, and jump. Those are the ones that were in our input actions right here. So what we can do is inside of the events and the player, we can click a little plus on the move. We can drag in our player movement script, and then inside of the function we can go to our player movement and then click move, so it's player movement.move inside of the move. Inside of the jump we can click a plus. We can drag in our player movement script. Inside the function, go to the player movement and click jump. Now if we wanted to add something like a fire to our player, like if he fires or shoots something, inside of our player movement script we would add a method called fire and then add something in there that would happen every time we click the fire button. So now what we can do is we can save up our little scene right here and then click play to see if our game will start working. Now before entering play mode, I'm getting a little error right here that says the variable of ground check circle of player movement has not been assigned, and that's alright. So if we go out of play mode right here, go into our player, and then I can see that I have not assigned my ground check circle. I can just take the ground check circle and then drag it into this transform right here, and then click play again to see if our game will work this time. Now once we've entered play mode, we can see that our player has dropped down to the ground, and then if we use our arrow keys and the space button, we can jump and move around. We cannot jump twice if we're not on the ground, and that's because we added that is grounded little boolean. We can move across this little pathway right here and then jump around to here, and then our tutorial right here is finished. Thank you for following along through this tutorial. If you like this tutorial, please give our channel a like and a subscribe because it really helps out our channel. Thank you.